we're here wrapping up our series on hot rod history. We're coming into the late 90s, early 2000s, kind of up a little bit till present day, but we're kind of bringing the traditional hot rods back this time, for good or worse, because that also brought a lot of the rat rods, you know, some of the rockabilly stuff, but it really kind of flipped the hot rod and street rod world kind of on its head and kind of went back to its roots a little bit with the next generation.
Thank God, too.
And it was kind of funny. We were, you know, looking through some older magazines, and found an old street rod from, you know, about this time period, and there was at least a dozen ads, all advertising fiberglass body, kit cars, you know, chassis, fully built, like you could mail order a hot rod and pick your color, basically.
Well, that's kind of the funny thing. I remember at that time period that we were working in media, and it kind of seemed like that was the, you know, like Street Rodder magazine was more like Popular Mechanics, because you could get a kit and build it yourself, right?
Yeah, it was like the model car kits that they made in the 60s from all the hot rods, but do it full size, or even, I think there was even stuff that was like scaled down, or, you know, stuff like that. But it's interesting. So like we talked a little bit last time about, you know, the Boyd Coddington hot rods, John Butera, really expanding in the 90s. The Billet Wheel Company, you know, they were the first aftermarket company to go public on the stock market. But in 96, they declared bankruptcy and had to reshuffle, reorganize. This is when, and then that allowed, you know, Chip Foose kind of to go off on his own, or forced him to go off on his own, start up his shop. And that kind of continued on a lot of that same style. And then obviously Boyd came back. Later on, they had the TV show American Hot Rod, you know, so they kept going. But it was around that same time that we had SoCal Speed Shop start back up with Alex Exidius and Pete Shaporis. But that traditional hot rod, the rat rod, rockabilly stuff was also starting around that time, because there was a show, Viva Las Vegas, that started in 97 or 98 as well. Around that same time.
Well, I think also, too, what people got to remember is, first off, popular music, too. We had bands coming out. We had bands like
Big Bad Voodoo Daddy. Yeah, all the, well, even from the ska era, that brought back in the jazz and the big band era. You know, Brian Setzer orchestra. That came out, obviously, that was the Stray Cats in the early 80s. So when we were talking about the hot rods coming back then, well, hey, now Brian Setzer, now rockabilly, psychobilly, you know, all that stuff's relevant again.
Rev and Horton Heat, like that kind of stuff, where things just, it kind of went back to, like, people wanted to live the 50s lifestyle. So rockabilly made a lot of sense.
So the artwork, the slick back, you know, pompadours, the pinup girls, the tattoos, even traditional tattoos. I mean, the Ed Hardy. I mean, a lot of the Ed Hardy and Von Dutch stuff came back and then went kind of total Hollywood, you know, douchebag. But
of course,
but that, you know, it was all that same culture and that style that really went into the mainstream again, you know, in the late 90s and early 2000s.
And even so much so that Hot Rod Magazine even coined the term Gen X hot rodders. You know, because these were the guys that were old enough.
It weren't the baby boomers.
No.
The baby boomers were the ones getting the high dollar street rods built by these guys.
Because they wanted to relive their youth, but they wanted to relive their youth as, I have the better car, where these guys, the Gen X guys, were looking at this, I want the Jenny. I want the real article. You know?
Well, and I think that probably is a mix of, A, there's always going to be a counter to whatever the popular thing is. B, you look at the guys working in the back of Boyd's shop or some of these other places, you know, like, in the 90s, like, you had guys like Jesse James that were working at Boyd's. You had, you know, a lot of people that were Gen X guys that were getting a paycheck. They didn't own the company. They didn't own the shop. So they were working on all those high-end builds. But, like, if someone came in and maybe they had an old 32, but they're like, oh, I want a full custom body or I want a full custom chassis. Well, that guy in the back's like, well, I'll take that.
Exactly. Well, case in point, basically Jimmy Shine. I mean, you look at him. He was the young guy that was working with, you know, Pete Shaporis and those guys reopening SoCal Speed Shop. So I think he was kind of that breath of fresh air that Pete Shaporis was looking at too. Like, he was looking towards, like,
you had
what are you young kids doing?
Generations of hot rodding under that one roof. So yeah, you're going to look, if Alex was looking to Pete as the new guy, Pete's looking at Jimmy as the new guy, and bring them all together, and you can have some really cool stuff coming out.
And I think actually that was kind of that perfect storm too, because, you know, Jimmy being enthusiastic about learning about it. Well, he's got Alex, who's the guy.
Yeah.
And he can say, hey, you know, Alex, was this the cool thing? Was that the cool thing?
And that's the thing too, is,
for reference,
is what is good is that a lot of the Gen X hot rodder guys did kind of acknowledge or looked to the old guys, you know, maybe not the baby boomers, but the guys before that, you know, so maybe their grandpa,
their grandfather,
and go, okay, let me do what he did.
Yeah.
Let me, you know, use some of those parts and kind of, you know, mix things up a little bit. And it, you brought in a little bit of other cultures that kind of crossed over or overlapped and kind of developed its own new style. Like I remember on Jimmy Shine's truck, you know, obviously all bare metal, you know, stuff like that. So that became kind of a thing.
That was a big thing, yeah.
And a lot of that is because, I don't want to pay for paint or can't afford paint, and this body's kind of beat up.
Right.
But yeah, he had an iron cross on the door of that. You know, obviously Jesse James, when he started, you know, West Coast Choppers, that was his logo.
Right.
You know, so all that kind of style from that era that maybe wasn't put on hot rods back then, but it kind of was of that time. Hold on. Maybe you know more.
Hold on, because the debate of Jesse James's Iron Cross logo, which of course we all know what an Iron Cross is.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not.
We won't say it on here because we don't want to get demonetized.
Right. Exactly. But Schneider Cams was the one that really flew that logo for many decades. So, you know, and that was the debate. Did Jesse get it from Schneider Cams? Well, Jesse flat out said, he goes, dude, I got it from just going to hot rod shops.
Yeah.
Because he would see that logo everywhere.
Around, and it was something that he just kind of borrowed and adapted. And that's what's cool. Yeah, you throw then the old English Southern California kind of, you know, cholo gangster lettering on it, and it's your own thing.
Exactly.
And that's, so yeah, we talk about Jesse James. He had his hand in a lot of hot rod builds.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously more known as a bike builder.
Right.
But I think the attention that he started getting in the early 2000s from his documentary and then obviously Monster Garage, that kind of made, if you were looking at the street rod crowd at that time that were doing fiberglass bodies and bolting them onto a chassis and painting them with flames or, you know, something like that and put a bunch of billet parts on. Then you've got guys that are hand forming metal fenders that are welding again, you know, and are hand beating sheet metal. That kind of flips it all back. And so you have the younger guys that are doing the same techniques. Like I remember him having the English wheel that no one, like at that time, I'm like, what the hell is an English wheel? Now it's, you know, a normal thing in a shop, but when you have a fiberglass body, you don't need an English wheel.
Well, and honestly, it was like the auto shop or metal shop misfits had now finally came back into the mainstream. And like you mentioned, at that time, there were a lot of, I don't want to call it this, but I guess soft builders where guys were just doing, like you're saying, mail order rods. What color do you want? What shiny wheel do you want on it down the road? And these guys that now, the Gen X hot rodders, look back at this like, I don't want any of that. I don't want it to look like anything like that. I want it to look like the traditional, like I just pulled this thing out of a garage from 50 years ago. And pretty much that's what they had to do. I mean, there were certain swap meets you would go to. I know like the Long Beach swap meet was a big, you know, place for
the LA Roadster swap meet there.
But there was also the Big Threes down in San Diego, you know, we're talking a lot about West Coast stuff, but that's kind of where this stuff started. It started with swap meets. It started with old parts. We didn't have I guess we had Craigslist, but barely.
I was going to say, not even probably.
I mean,
not in the early 2000s.
We're still recycler. We're still, you know, doing stuff like that where you didn't have this big, broad, like Facebook marketplace where you can say, I want a, you know, mirror from 1930 and click here, you know.
So you can
that
find
was totally
it.
Different.
The internet was there, but not, I'm sure a fraction of these guys were even thinking about it. And that's that kind of traditional hot rod sense then kind of, it's funny, like we talked about hot rod being originally a derogatory term that then was adopted. Even looking at this, like the term funny car for drag racing was a derogatory term
at first,
and then it was adopted as a standard thing. You know, traditional rods, I don't think that's never had any derogatory tie to it, but then a lot of the fancy street rod guys started throwing the traditional guys in with kind of the rat rods. Because
Well,
that term
yeah.
popped up in the late 90s as well.
Well, I guess the only derogatory term that I would think for a street rod or a hot rod from back in the day would be the word jalopy.
And that's, from the 30s and the 40s, or not maybe the 30s, but like the 40s and the 50s, the jalopies were,
Right.
There was a jalopy race. Before there was a hot rod race, being termed in the late 40s, they were jalopies. And that's what's funny. You look at the early hot rods, which these traditional guys are looking after, and you're like, these are jalopies.
They are, right.
Because they were cobbled together.
They were home-built.
From home-built
Yes.
parts that were 20 years old when cars were not meant to last 40 years.
Right.
And from the junkyard or from their spare parts in their garage and kind of put together.
Which gave it kind of that freedom too, if you think about it. I mean, because you're driving something that could kill you.
Well, and that and I think too that probably gave a lot of the Gen X hot rodders, the younger guys that grew up in 60s and 70s cars,
right,
that were driving 80s and 90s new cars,
right.
Then to hop into a 29 Model A or a 32 Deuce, and go down the road, and it was a little sketchy. That was exciting. So that was recapturing. It was the antithesis of the lawn chair cruise night hot rod guy that shows up at 4:00 in the afternoon for a 7:00 nighttime cruise night.
Right.
These were the kids that were kind of having fun with it and doing what hot rods should be doing.
Well, let's talk about that for a little bit here too, because you're right. There was the street rod guy that was your Corvette owner with the New Balances and jean shorts.
Yeah.
But the Gen X hot rodders, they took this to heart. I mean, they would wear original Levi 501s. They would wear engineer boots. They would wear the flannel Pendleton shirts.
like the Pendletons, or like the white T-shirt undershirts.
Right.
And, roll up the sleeves.
They were living the lifestyle.
Yeah.
These guys, you could tell, like if you went to Disneyland and walked around and you saw a guy with a white T-shirt and 501s
cuffed
and
Levi's,
you would know, like, that's a hot rodder.
Yeah.
You would flat out identify that guy.
Yeah. And chances are he's got some Clay Smith cam tattoo or something on his arm.
Well, let's talk about it. Here's a famous tattoo artist became and we should talk about how they developed clubs at this time too.
Yeah, a lot of the clubs kind of some of them came back, and then some newer clubs started to pop up that were based around the traditional stuff.
One I can think of right off the top of my head is Jack Ruby.
Yeah.
Who was a traditional tattoo artist.
Not Jack Ruby that did the Lee Harvey Oswald thing. Jack Rudy. Yeah, the tattoo artist.
Right. My slip on that one. Yes, that's kind of a big slip too.
A little bit.
I'm not pin that on him.
Yeah,
but no, he was a traditional traditional tattoo artist.
Yeah, very well known
from Long Beach. Obviously, the Pike was a big deal back in the 40s and the 30s when they were doing traditional tattoo work.
All from the sailors coming over.
Exactly. So it was a total lineage from that time period.
Mm-hmm.
He's one of the founding members of the Beatniks.
Yeah.
And the Beatniks, to me, they were the famous guys.
They were very well known. I mean, obviously purple was their color, so you see all the purple shirts or some of the purple cars,
the car coats and
the
stuff.
Car coats. Mm-hmm. And that that came back in style too.
Forgot about that. Yeah.
All that kind of 50s stuff. But the Beatniks, to me, they did some hot rods and stuff, but they, like the customs seemed to be a little more where they dialed into, but they were just really trying to capture that old school style a little bit.
You've got the influence of Alex Gambino being in. He's also
Gambino
another member.
Customs, yep.
And he does a lot of customs, like you're mentioning. Of course, you have guys like James Hatfield that have money to build things, and Rick Dorr is one of the members as well. So it kind of made sense for those guys to have like the cool, the expensive.
No,
parts.
and that's what they were of the traditional stuff. They were the nice kind of traditional stuff. Another club that was around at the time, I'm not 100% sure if they're still active.
Okay.
And maybe they are, but like the Burbank Choppers.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And what's interesting, we talked about Foose and Troy Trepanier in the last episode.
Right.
Talking about the TV show that obviously Boyd started getting in the early 2000s, and same with Jesse James. Rides episodes, the TV show Rides, was a huge thing because it showcased multiple different hot rod shops.
Yeah.
Started with Foose, did Troy Trepanier, did multiple shops around the country, but they did an episode on the Burbank Choppers as the young, traditional old school guys.
Yeah, exactly.
The garage built guys, the guys hanging out in their garage, drinking beers and, working on some old school, chopped hot rods.
And it makes sense. I mean, that was what was popular at the time, and still still kind of popular to this day as well.
Yeah.
You know.
No, and one of the early members of that was featured in that show was Troy Ladd, who we'll bring up later on, talking about Hollywood Hot Rods as being kind of one of the premier shops that honed in on the traditional, kind of look and style, and helped spawn several other shops.
Right.
But I remember too you telling a story about one of your neighbors, kind of similar type of a setup where it's like, have all your buddies over in the garage, hang out and build hot rods versus mail ordering a hot rod and having it done over at a shop.
Well, yeah, Rob Marksworth is my neighbor who he's one of the original Shifters, which another club that kind of came out at that time where they were focused on traditional hot rods.
Yeah, and I think were the Shifters a club, or at least that name was there.
That name was from back in the day. But this is when they actually formed it,
restarted
the Gen X version, I guess if you want to call it better. Brought it back. Yeah. But that's the thing. Rob is exactly what I mentioned. He looks like a greaser. Right, and I know that's another derogatory term from the 50s.
True, and that was coming from the hair.
Yeah, exactly. Or my mom used to call them hodads. Hodads are anybody that didn't live by the beach.
Oh, okay.
Right, so he fit that hodad part. But yeah, he also
it's a hamburger spot.
I know, right?
Yeah, that's how I know it. But
yeah, but he also got a 29 coupe with a blown Chrysler Hemi. Not and again too. Now we're getting into very traditional stuff because people always know Hemis. They think of the word Dodge. They think, oh, it's a Dodge.
No, but Hemi. A lot of people would put a Hemi in their hot rod because it was just a big motor.
Right, yeah. Absolutely. But this and also too, you got to remember at the time there was also the company DeSoto. So finding that obscure car company to have a Chrysler Imperial Hemi was different than just having a Dodge Hemi. So it's kind of cool how they found
some of the unique creative. The creativity to it, because that's obviously you look at a lot of those and it's same parts, same techniques, same styling as what was done in the 40s and the 50s.
Right.
But then sometimes they put their own little spin on it or borrow some stuff from the motorcycle world or throw in some rat fink, type styling and, crazy shifter or something like that to just kind of mix it up a little bit and create their own look.
Well, the shifters though too, what I kind of liked about them is they were very into period correctness. So another car that sticks out from the Shifters to me is Marky's car,
Purple People Eater or something.
Yeah. Which if you look at that car it's a freak. I mean, it literally is a freak.
Yeah.
But and you look at the tall blower and all other stuff, and you look at this little car. I mean, even like when it accelerates, the whole car jumps off the ground. I mean, it really is something to look at.
I remember seeing cars like that rolling into a show. And you're just like, they do not want to sit in line getting into a car show. This is not meant for that.
But the funny thing about it is, horsepower-wise, you look at that going like, oh, that big blower, it's got to be a big block Chevy or something like that. No, that thing's an Oldsmobile. It's an old rocket motor, which if you think, rocket motors were huge hot rod motors.
Back then.
Yeah.
So we're talking about all these hot rods and hot rod shows. The Grand National Roadster Show is one of the most iconic. What's really cool in the last couple of years is they've spun off to create the Grand National Truck Show. This year, September 26th, 27th at Pomona Fairplex. We'll be out there with a booth doing some live podcasts.
Yeah, if you're a truck fan, this is a show you want to go to because clearly they're going to crown, again, the world's most beautiful truck, the Wombat.
It's open to all year make models of trucks. This is not just a classic truck show or a hot rod truck show. C10s, square bodies, we're going to have a couple OBS trucks out there, but even mini trucks. I mean, what was really cool, you had a dancing bed competition there last year for all the mini truck guys. September 26th, 27th. You can get all your tickets at rodshows.com. You can register your truck for inside or outside drive-in, and you can even get tickets discounted at O'Reilly's.
That's right. Don't forget that. So
and come visit us.
That's it. Yeah, come by, say hi to us. We're going to be doing
podcasts. We're going to have some giveaways.
Yeah.
So come check it out. The Grand National Truck Show, Pomona Fairplex.
We'll sell you the seat, but you'll only need the edge.
Okay. That's like a good example, if you will, of one of those cars, that's over the top and done. But I remember specifically going to some of the Moon Eyes shows or Viva and some of this stuff back in the early 2000s or mid 2000s where you'd see stuff that was purposefully rat rod done.
Right.
Where you would see a chop that had been, sliced and cut crooked on purpose.
Right.
And, it wasn't just that maybe the guy didn't have the talent or the funds. they were purposefully trying to make something,
look kind of dangerous.
Look like a tetanus shot
right.
waiting to happen. Throw a bunch of spikes on it.
Yeah.
You were saying earlier, like the chain link bike, from a bike being welded together for struts or for a shifter or something like that. And seeing like the crappy spot welds, on the chop, or like a patch panel that was overlapped and like slightly crooked,
right?
So they were going for the wow factor and the purposefully rattiness of it, versus trying to make a traditional hot rod. But there were some things that were kind of looked at as a rat rod that still had a lot of nice work done to it.
Sure.
It just kind of a lot of things got lumped into that category at that time.
Well, one of those cars I think that comes up to me is, which a lot of people called a rat rod, but it wasn't even a rat rod. It wasn't even
and that's
a rod.
The thing. It was hobbled together. It was pieced together.
We're talking about James Crosby's Peterbilt cabbed hot rod,
Gizmos,
right?
Gizmo-ness or whatever it was that Courtney was calling it.
Right.
And so it was kind of a cobbled together in a rat rod fashion, but the finishing work and the actual engineering and work done to it was on par with any hot rod,
Well, that comes from James Crosby himself. I mean, James is a, second generation hot rod builder. I mean, his dad was responsible for building the goldenrod with the...
Not the Smothers brothers.
I know.
The Summer brothers.
No.
No?
No.
Oh.
Yeah. Wow. This is really going to make me...
But anyways, so James was like more of a mini truck guy, motorcycle guy, but came from a hot rod lineage.
Right.
And he also saw too, how he could kind of bring some of the tricks from his world into the hot rod world with the Shockwave.
Right, exactly. And I mean, a lot of people don't really know that he was kind of the brainchild of the Shockwave, if you want to say that.
Yeah, he was one of the inventors.
Yeah.
One of the
And that was what's so funny was that technology was being used at the time on the high dollar hot rods that wanted an adjustable air suspension, but maybe it was equipped with coilovers before.
Well, yeah, you probably had some Alden coilovers on your hot rod that was built in the 80s.
Yeah.
And you're not necessarily going to cut it all up, or it was maybe a fiberglass body that you weren't modifying or cutting up to get lower and put an air system on, but these would bolt in and, Shockwave would bolt in and replace the coilover.
Right.
And without any, more or less any modifications, you have air suspension now on a hot rod.
Right. Which, at the time that the high dollar guys went totally right for that. They loved the fact of, I can have an adjustable suspension and my hot rod's going to ride good.
Yeah. Right? Well, and it was a cleaner setup a little bit than a lot of the air systems at the time. So it fit into that mail order street rod catalog, if you will. But yeah, his Crosby's Peterbilt that he did, it was, a Peterbilt truck cab.
Yeah.
So very rat rod,
repurposed. Let's call it
repurposed.
Right.
Yeah. But super low.
Yeah.
But it had billet wheels on it. It had a mix of everything.
It was a bobbed rear end cab. I mean, because it was only a truck cab.
Yeah.
The whole idea was to have that bobbed rear end look that we'd have from, like, say, the Bug from back in the 40s.
Mm-hmm.
So that he was paying homage to that. But there again too, he's still putting big wheels, low stance. Perfect kind of set proportions to that car, and it worked. It looked like a street rod, or it looked like an old hot rod, but it was actually a Peterbilt truck.
Yeah, Peterbilt truck cab, and it was cool. I remember it debuting at SEMA, or being at SEMA in Firestone's booth,
right?
Obviously for the air suspension that was on it, and kind of at the time, it was when a traditional hot rod or a rat rod or something that was bare metal wasn't necessarily being shown in Hot Rod Alley at SEMA.
Exactly.
It was all the high-end street rods or muscle cars and stuff like that was kind of being shown, so it did get a lot of attention.
I mean, if you look at, I guess let's compare Jerry Magnuson's Boydster 2, that 1A MBR.
Yeah.
Right? And then you look at something like that James was building at that time. If you look at those two in comparison, I mean...
Probably the craftsmanship and the quality on both are exactly the same.
That's what I was going for. But they look completely different.
Yeah. And I would still say that Magnuson's car still looks like a beautiful perfect car. Hot rod. Like I wouldn't, there's a lot of street rods at that time period in the early 2000s, late 2000s that were just god awful.
Yes.
But like that one was great example, tastefully done. Because you got to remember at this time too, when we're talking about all these traditional hot rods coming out, on the high end, you had guys like Foose and Troy Trepanier building cars like Impression and you know, all these cars that are winning all the top awards that are $500,000.
$500,000?
No, I'm saying back then.
Yeah.
20 years ago, $500,000 car was a
that was a serious
huge,
car.
serious car. Yeah. But tons of full one-off everything on it.
Yeah.
And then you have the guys that were probably in the back of that shop that were jumping around in their Model A or something on the weekend.
Right.
Yeah.
Or they're taking something off of look at Chip. He built that 35 Grandmaster for Wes Rydell. And if you kind of look at that, it's a beautiful car. There's no way to say anything different about it. But then you just think, if I would have worked at that time, I would have took this off of that car and put it on my A-bone. Right. Yeah. So that's kind of like, I think where most of those guys were thinking that. But, you know, again, moving on to some of the other things that happened in the day, like if you look at some of the, to me, traditional hot rods have a very good look or they have a very ratty look. And I think the example that I like to look at is Jack Carroll's car, who he has his 5-window coupe. To me, is that quintessential. I don't want to call it perfect because there isn't a perfect car, but if you want to look up a definition, Jack Carroll's car
of like wouldn't change a thing. Nope. Everything looks traditional, but just everything's dialed in on it. And, and that's the thing. It's like a lot of the styling of the traditional stuff started to creep into the street rod world because like obviously those guys were all influenced by what the younger guys were doing, and the younger guys started to come up and get better customers and better paying jobs and open up shops of their own, to then, you know, but they're not going to build the fiberglass mail order street rod that's over the top. They're going to do what they want to do.
Right. I mean, literally that show Monster Garage too helped that out too, because people looked at that as, I want to do that too.
Well, and props to Jesse on that, where he did an episode, and I think a handful of episodes, where he got guys like Bill Hines and Gene Winfield, and I think Fat Jack.
Yeah, Fat Jack was on the show. Yeah,
like a handful of those guys, to come in and do a traditional custom, you know, do kind of traditional hot rods, and show it to literally the entire world.
And Jesse was smart at that too, because he captured all of those traditional hot rod builders. He captured their work or their craftsmanship into one car.
Yeah.
So you have Winfield, you have Hines, you have Fat Jack, you've got, you know, all of those guys into one car. That's that's a very holy grail car.
Well, and and we mentioned earlier on some of the episodes where, like, Rod and Custom magazine, you know, the truck that they did, the Dream truck that you looked at the list of who worked on it, or even the, you know, like the Eliminator coupe, or no, was it the, what car was it now?
We're both having that day.
Yeah, we're both having that day. But there was like some cars from some of these eras that had like the top to bottom, all the top people worked on it, you know, in every category. And so it was kind of bringing that back, and it was bringing that appreciation back for old school lead work, you know, lead slinging with Bill Hines, you know, or the old school fade paint job from, you know, Gene Winfield. And so it kind of stamped kind of those old school guys as, no, these are the guys that you should look at of what they're building versus what you can find in the back of a magazine.
Right. And I think that's what, going back to Jack Carroll's car, if you look at it, it checks all the right boxes. Like, you look at just vehicle stance. And I don't mean the height of the roof or anything. I mean just the way that the car looks from 50 feet away.
Yeah.
It has that perfect stance. It has the right size wheel. It does have the right chop. It has the right channel.
It all works together.
It all works. And I think what really drives me or
attracts me to
this car. See, again, we're having this bad day. I think what
attracts me, I thought you're almost going to say drives me crazy.
No, I was thinking about it driving, because it's driving me crazy. I couldn't think of the word attract. But no, what attracts me to that car is that car looks good in a black and white photo, because you don't know if that car's from 1950, or it looks good in a color photo because you don't know if it was taken yesterday. Yeah. That, to me, I think is what always
and that's always the definition to me of timeless.
Right.
Where timeless doesn't necessarily mean that it was built exactly how someone would have done it in 1950.
Right.
It just means that the styling of it is you're never going to be able to definitively date it to a certain time, or even if you do, it still looks good now.
Exactly.
Whereas like you can look through, we were looking through an old Street Rodder, from 20 years ago earlier, and a lot of the cars being featured, you can tell was, okay, that is that time period.
It totally
is. The wheels are
Yeah.
that time period.
Yeah.
The LED, the taillights are that time period.
Exactly.
You can pinpoint it, and it's no longer timeless,
It
basically, at that point,
it,
because
right.
now it doesn't look like, if you brought it out now, you'd go, hey, those wheels are old, you know?
Yep.
And it hasn't been old enough that they cycled back into being cool again, But what was really interesting on that Street Rodder is their readers' rides, if you will, in the back, their little one-page features,
right,
were all traditional hot rods, were all either primered or flat or patina paint jobs on it. So it was like Street Rodder magazine wasn't acknowledging basically traditional hot rods as a thing at that time.
Well, they didn't have an advertiser yet.
I was going to say that, well, no, I mean, you look at all of their advertisers, none of them were catering to that style.
Not at all. Right.
Yeah.
And it's kind of funny. I looking back at that, it reminds me of a guy I grew up with that I worked for, this guy, Ralph Muldoon, that he'd always look at a car that looked dated, and he'd always say, that's sour milk.
Mm-hmm.
Like
it's past its time.
It's past its time. And that's what he always, that's sour milk car. Don't look at that car.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's what, looking at that magazine today, that's what I looked at. I looked at a bunch of expired dates.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, and that's, what's interesting too about, we talked about some of the shows like Viva, the Grand National Roadster Show, which is obviously kind of the pinnacle of hot rods and street rods. They started going through some changes around the late 2000s, around some of that time. They were catering more towards the traditional and custom guys, which is funny. They opened up the Suede Palace.
Exactly.
Which now, if you go into the Suede Palace, none of the cars are suede or primered. They all have paint jobs. Maybe some of them are lacquer or just single stage or something simple.
Right.
But, all that has stepped up. But that was for the rockabilly guys, the pinup girls, the upright bass, players and the guys with big old pompadours to bring that back into the Roadster Show a little bit, where, Building 4, you had the guys still spending $500,000, but they changed the judging at that time period as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Because you mentioned Jack Carroll's car, of like the look of it, the profile, the stance. I specifically remember, I think it was maybe 2010 or so.
Right.
The car that won Amber, everybody, when the guy hopped in it to drive it out of the show, or load it into the trailer, everybody gasped and was like, wait, that one?
Yeah.
Because it just did not look right.
Right.
The guy was over the top of the windshield. Like, it did not look comfortable to drive.
Yeah.
The proportions were all crazy.
Right.
And they really changed the judging for the America's Most Beautiful Roadster at that time to take into account the proportions, the style. How did it look in profile?
Right.
How did it look with someone driving it?
Yeah.
Did it look comfortable to drive, or did it look like a hot rod should when someone's actually driving it?
Right.
As they should.
Well, it's the difference. Is it a Hot Wheel or is it a car you want to drive?
Yeah.
That's really kind of what comes out of that.
And that's, I remember, even, this is obviously a different topic, different day, but like, lowrider shows, they always had to everything had to be functional.
Yes.
On it. It's the same thing with these, high-end hot rod shows, where they wanted, it had to drive in, had to have headlights, or it had to get in under its own, and it had to be a car, basically.
Be a car, right.
Because if, you were mentioning one time about having your 57 or whatever at SEMA, and it hadn't been wired up yet.
Yes.
None of the engine wasn't wired yet, and someone like, oh man, you did such a clean wiring job on this. I don't see a single wire. And it's like, because there's none.
No single wire in it. Yeah.
So you can build a super nice car if you don't have to make it actual functional and run.
And I think that's something that, yes, because we know of shows, Riddler and, those kind of shows where these cars are kind of unobtainable. But at the same time too, I think it's important that the car starts, drives.
Yeah. No, it should still be a car.
It should be a car. It's not a pusher.
It's not, well, it is an art piece, but it's not a statue.
Exactly.
It's a car.
There you go. Yeah.
But I think that judging also then helped, and it's also too just time period of younger builders, younger audience, paying for these builds or wanting some of the traditional styling, where it helped kind of you know, you look at some of the cars that won Amber at that time versus later on when like Troy Ladd, you know, that we mentioned earlier with the Burbank Choppers and Hollywood Hot Rods, that were a very traditional style hot rod shop, not only in how the design of it, but like how they would build them by hand.
Well, that's okay. I think that's the big rub, if you want to call it that, because you look back at the fiberglass mail order hot rods that were in the 90s. You look at Boyd and you look at, you know, the big powerhouse names back then, and they were building nice stuff. I'm not going to take that away from them at all. But then if you look at the Gen X explosion, the Gen X hot rodders, how you have, you know, the Troy Ladds, you know, you have these guys that are showing up with $3 and $4 million builds now. And you look at the craftsmanship that they've been doing too. I mean, let's talk about Troy for a second. Mulholland Speedster.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, yeah, it was the Mulholland Speedster.
Right. I'm
now
saying that right.
Yeah. Now, so that was 2017.
Right.
You know, later on, and that was a
car built around a grill shell.
Yeah.
Right.
Hand built, you know, metal car, but a very different, you know, they were going for an Art Deco style, you know, big bodied car versus the little, but it's still a roadster, still qualified under that.
But then even a couple of years later, he ends up building a roadster. That again wins the Slonaker.
Yeah. But, well, no, and that's, I mean, it wasn't a roadster, but it was a coupe.
I'm sorry, that's right.
Yeah, because that's, you know, obviously, if it was a roadster,
it would go AMBR.
You would have put it in an AMBR.
Right.
But yeah, you look at that, you look at it close-ups of that, they're using a lot of the techniques from the 40s, from the 50s, even the 30s.
Right.
With the coach-built stuff, with the early hot rod stuff, you know, tons of exposed rivets.
Yes.
You know, that became a popular thing as well with like the bomber seats.
Yeah.
You know, and the door panels where it was all raw aluminum, dimple dyed.
Right.
And then exposed rivets, basically showing this was a handmade from a piece of flat metal.
Right.
And I'm showing my work.
Right.
I'm showing my craftsmanship. And that, I think maybe that might have been a little bit of an answer to the rat rod stuff where if you have all these street rod guys with the nice fancy stuff and everything's hidden on how it was actually put together, seeing like the kind of crappy rat rod stuff, well, some of the traditional guys were like, well, no, I can weld better than you can.
Right.
I can actually create this out of flat sheet metal.
Yeah.
But I'm going to show it.
Right.
I'm going to show it off. So I'm going to leave it bare metal.
Yeah.
You know, and that's been a long time tradition that I don't know if he started, but like Troy Ladd has done that where whatever the car that's going to be finished and compete for the top honors the next year or 2 years later, he'll have in his booth in bare metal.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then even Troy Trepanier did that, you know, in the last couple of years with the Amber car. It was in his booth in bare metal to show off all that work, show off all the craftsmanship, and show kind of that it is all hand built and one off versus being a kit car.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, here's something that kind of stands out to me too. I don't know if really Troy has ever thought about this, but
which Troy?
Troy Ladd.
Okay,
I should.
We got to do that now.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, because even then there's another. You know, there's another Troy that's in the same. You know, BBT fab.
That's true.
You know, that does a lot of high end nice work as well.
But just the location of and Troy didn't grow up in the valley, so this is why I know that this isn't. But I'm reading into this because Troy being from or a shop being out in the valley in Burbank. Yeah. Him being a member of the Burbank Choppers. The amount of aircraft that was built during the war in Burbank area.
Well, and what's funny now is his shop now is right by the Burbank airport.
That's what I'm saying. I don't know if that was an influence to him. I mean, it's something maybe we got to ask him one of these days. But, you know, I mean, like you mentioned, the aircraft rivets, the dimple dies, the aircraft tools to build cars
and that's probably a lot of it is all the old machinery that you could pick up. Yeah. From that area, you know, it's the same thing that we talked about when Jesse James was coming up and making the English wheel popular again.
So I've got a personal deal to that. So my grandfather was a sheet metal operator for Rockwell International, actually North American Aircraft, if we really go back to when he started. And he was one of the guys that hand hammered out the first P-51 Mustang airplane. So he worked his way up through, through his work to a sheet metal supervisor, and they had a giant machine called a Yoder. Yeah. And as a kid, I remember going to his work, and that was the biggest thing because I saw this big machine that just would hammer things, just boom, boom, boom.
Oh yeah, it's probably super loud, and it's probably at your eye level too.
No, I had to look up.
Or I had to look up,
right. And so now, flash forward 25 years later, I go to Jesse's shop in Long Beach, and he's offloading a new equipment. And he goes, "Oh, I got this bitchin' thing. I got it from an old aircraft place that was over in El Segundo, where
you grew up." Yeah.
All of a sudden, I look and they're offloading this thing off this semi truck, and it's my grandfather's Yoder. And I went, "Did you get that from Douglas Street on Blow?" And he's like, "Oh yeah." He goes, "It used to be Rockwell." And he's like, "Yeah." And I'm like, "That was my grandfather was in charge of that." So of course my grandfather was still alive that year. He died that year.
Okay.
So I said, "Hey,
did you?
And I mentioned, I go, "Is this your Yoder?" And he goes, "Yeah, that's it." And so of course I had the connection into like telling Jesse, I go, "Hey, like my grandfather knew everything about them. He told me like when they ordered it, when it was, put into service and everything." So it was kind of cool to see like that machine was being repurposed. My grandfather was in love with it because he was like, "Wow," he goes, "I don't even know anybody that can even use that machine."
Well, and that's what it was too. A lot of it is that, if no aircraft company was using that anymore to make aircrafts, there's newer machines, there's computers, there's all that.
Right.
So,
that old technology had to go
somewhere. If you can figure it out, how to work it,
right? I mean, Jesse did pretty well doing it. So
no, and that's what kind of helped bring a lot of the younger guys into the industry, but wanting to learn how to do it, and wanting to learn how to, make it by hand, and do all of that. Jumping a little more, I don't know, not recently, but in the last 15 years, we talk about the traditional stuff. There's been, obviously, there's the huge resurgence of the traditional hot rods, and that being the styling that's kind of now the most popular, if you will.
Sure.
I have a feeling there already has been a little bit of the cycle back of, get some cheesy 80s, stuff, and that's just for fun.
Right.
But there's been a lot of events, obviously, that have popped up, a lot of things revitalized. I mean, Pasadena's, there's been the reliability run that's been going on for a very long time.
Right, yeah.
But it's become more popular again, where you can take your pre-war World War II car, and run it for 100 miles and see how it performs, and keep them on the road as they should be.
And the funny thing about that is recreating the past, because that's what they used to do. I mean, I know some people call them rallies, but reliability run was the coined term of doing a rally.
And that's because at the time, now we're talking 100-year-old cars on some of these, so it really is a reliability run. But there's also races like the Race of Gentlemen that we've gone to on both coasts, where that's back to what we started talking about originally in this series of land speed racing on the beach.
Yep.
They've done it in Wildwood, New Jersey. We've done it out in Pismo.
Right.
But it's all, I think for motorcycles, it's pre-48.
Yeah.
Because that's the cutoff year of the engine.
And it was,
and then is
pre-36?
I think so, because I want to say it was only flatheads.
Right.
So it's only flatheads for the cars.
Yeah.
And then also too, like I remember when it was really cool. I mean, obviously they do the whole set of, the look and the feel, and it's meant to look like kind of old school stuff. But I remember, as being media and photography, we had rules for what we could wear.
Right.
If we were going to be on the sidelines or the starting lines, so that way none of the photos looked like
today.
Right. Like you could look at it and go, was that from 1942 or was that from 2012?
Cool. Right. Super cool.
Yeah. So it's like, I remember, I was like, okay, I'm going to put a Pendleton on and jeans.
Right.
Like, all right, I'm good.
Yeah.
But you're not wearing a baseball hat with the LA Dodgers, or you're not wearing, a t-shirt, with a logo on it and stuff like that, because it wasn't going to fit the style of the cars. What is really cool is seeing, a lot of the high-end street rod builds now, like coming out of, Bill Ganal's shop, like South City Rod and Custom,
right?
Who's Pat Ganal's son, is very traditional in its styling, but they're using all modern technology to build it. Maybe they're 3D scanning stuff, or they're, using some 3D printing and CNC billet work, but it's all to create something that's higher quality than what it was, but it still has the same styling from the 40s or the 50s.
Which I think kind of comes down to the word refinement, which if we flip back to, guys like Boyd and Little John Batera, that's what they were doing. They were refining the older stuff.
Yeah.
So now you look at, it comes full circle. Now we've got guys that are refining traditional looking things. Yeah. So, I mean, to me, hot rodding is alive and well and is doing well.
And that's, we mentioned with like the, Hot Rod magazine, and the term hot rod has encompassed everything from muscle cars to trucks to anything that's a custom car or a more, powerful performance car.
Right.
But, once again, like we talked with South City Rod and Custom with Bill Ganal, like they did the Dare to Be Different, coupe that was, I think it's a 34, maybe a 35 coupe, and some traditional styling, but then like a guy like Kobe Gerwitz, whose brother is actually one of the photographers for the NHRA.
Right.
And he's designed tons of, really cool cars and actually did a lot of movie posters.
Yeah.
But, he designed it kind of like, I think you were saying like the funny car style graphics.
The Lifesaver paint job.
The Lifesaver paint job where it's 2-tone or 3-tone, but
it's like a pack of Lifesavers.
Going this direction, not,
right.
Horizontal.
Yeah.
And yeah, you put a regular paint job on it and it looks like a really nice street rod from the 50s.
Right.
But yeah, they're doing something different, mixing it up a little bit, mixing some different eras together, but in a tasteful way.
Right. To
kind of bring what modern hot rodding is and, specific to like those 30s and 40s cars.
Right, exactly.
So this has kind of been the journey of hot rods. We've strayed off here and there as the history of the hot rod has.
Sure.
But we've kind of tried to at least keep it within the, Model A, Model T, 30s Deuce cars, like that kind of era of what hot rodding started out as and what's been done, since then. Cause, you've got, like we said, the shops like Hollywood Hot Rods, South City Rod and Custom, Anvil Speed Shop, like tons of shops all over that are doing traditional style hot rods again at a high level.
Hallelujah.
Yeah. And so where hot rodding's going from here is anyone's, guess. We have seen some EV swapped
This is true.
hot rods, for better or worse.
Time will tell that.
Take your pick.
Yeah.
But I think, maybe next time we're going to take some of the branches that spawned off from hot rodding and kind of dive into those a little bit more. So that's your drag racing, your customs, your low riders, kind of just further showing the history of hot rod in all its forms.
Love it.